The conversation that costs a man everything rarely sounds like a conversation that costs a man everything. It sounds like two neighbors talking at a farm sale on a Tuesday afternoon in late March, leaning against a fence post, watching someone else's equipment get auctioned off while their own machines sit back home waiting for spring work. It sounds casual. It sounds like the kind of talk that happens 100 times between farmers who know each other well enough to speak plainly and trust that plain speech means something. It sounds, to anyone who might have been standing close enough to hear it, like nothing in particular. Gary Mossfeld is 54 years old and has been farming the same ground his grandfather broke in 1941. He runs 1,400 acres of corn and soybeans, owns his home place outright, and carries a manageable level of operating debt that his banker has never once flagged as a concern. He is not a reckless man. He is not the kind of farmer who makes decisions without thinking them through, who buys on impulse or trades on emotion or lets a good story override a careful calculation. He has been farming long enough to have watched other men make those kinds of decisions and to have observed, with the particular clarity of someone watching from the outside, exactly how those decisions tend to end. What Gary is, in the specific way that sometimes makes careful men vulnerable to exactly the kind of mistake they would never make if they saw it coming straight on, is a man who trusts people he has known for a long time. His neighbor, Pete Schofield, farms the 800 acres directly to the east of Gary's home place. They have been neighbors for 22 years. Their kids went to the same schools. Their wives sit on the same church committee. They have helped each other through equipment breakdowns, through a bad hail year in 2009 that damaged both operations, through the particular loneliness of the 2012 drought when the crops were failing and the only people who understood what that felt like were the people standing in the same fields watching the same thing happen. Gary trusts Pete the way you trust someone after 22 years of that kind of history, which is completely and without the careful arm's length evaluation that he would apply to any transaction with someone he did not know that well. Pete has a Fendt. He has had it for 3 seasons, and he has talked about it since the day it arrived on his farm, with the kind of enthusiasm that Gary has always attributed to the natural excitement a man feels about a new machine in its first year of ownership, an enthusiasm that tends to moderate as the seasons pass and the machine becomes simply a tool rather than a recent acquisition. Pete's enthusiasm has not moderated. 3 seasons in, he is still talking about fuel efficiency, still talking about the Vario transmission, still talking about precision agriculture integration, and operator comfort and resale value trajectory. Gary has heard most of it more than once, and he has listened politely and made the appropriate responses and privately categorized Pete's ongoing commentary on the Fendt as the particular brand of equipment loyalty that successful farmers sometimes develop toward whatever machine they bought most recently at the highest price. At the farm sale that Tuesday in March, Pete brings it up again. Not aggressively, not as a sales pitch, just as the natural continuation of a conversation that has been running for 3 years on a low simmer. He mentions that his own operation is looking at adding a second large tractor, and that he has been thinking about moving the Fendt into a trade and going up to something newer. He mentions almost as an aside that Gary's MF 8670 is a solid machine, but that the Fendt would give him capabilities his current tractor does not have. He mentions the fuel efficiency numbers, which Gary has heard before. He mentions the transmission, which Gary has also heard before. And then Pete says something that Gary will think about many times in the months that follow. He says, "I will trade you straight across, your 8670 for my Fendt." No money changes hands. You get the upgrade, I get the older iron to work alongside whatever new machine I bring in, and we are both in a better position than we started. Gary does not say yes at the farm sale. He is not that impulsive. He says he will think about it, which is true, and he does think about it for the better part of 3 weeks, which is not as long as a decision of this kind deserves, but which feels sufficient at the time because the decision does not feel from the inside like the kind of decision that requires more than 3 weeks of consideration. The MF 8670 is paid off. has been paid off for 4 years. And 4 years of payment-free operation have made Gary perhaps slightly less attentive to the financial structure of any arrangement that allows him to upgrade without taking on new debt. The Fendt is newer. The Fendt has capabilities his current tractor does not have. The trade is straight across, no cash, no financing, no dealer, no paperwork beyond what two neighbors decide is adequate between themselves. Pete is someone Gary has trusted for 22 years. The decision, when Gary arrives at it on a Sunday evening after 3 weeks of turning it over, feels less like a calculated risk and more like an obvious move dressed in cautious clothing. He calls Pete the following Monday morning and says he will do it. They shake hands on it the following Thursday, when Pete drives over to look at the 8670 one more time, and Gary drives over to look at the Fendt. Neither man arranges a mechanical inspection. Neither man pulls service records from a dealer system or requests a compression test or puts either machine on a diagnostic scanner. They are neighbors. They know each other's equipment. Gary has seen that Fendt working Pete's fields for 3 seasons, and it has never, to his knowledge, given Pete a day's trouble worth mentioning. Pete knows the 8670 the same way. He has watched it work Gary's ground for years, and it is a known quantity in the way that a neighbor's equipment always is when the farms sit side by side and the fields are visible from each other's lane ends. They walk around both machines. They look at the obvious things. They start both engines, listen for a minute, and pronounce both machines satisfactory. The handshake happens in Pete's machine yard on a Thursday afternoon in late April, and by the following Saturday, both tractors have been moved to their new homes. Gary's MF 8670 is sitting in Pete's shed. Pete's Fendt is sitting in Gary's shed. No written agreement, no warranty transfer documentation, no dealer notification, no title work beyond what minimum state registration requirements demand, handled informally between two men who trust each other to do right by whatever the arrangement turns out to require. Gary spends a week getting familiar with the Fendt before spring field work begins. He is honest enough with himself to acknowledge that the machine is impressive in the ways that Pete always said it was impressive. The Vario transmission operates differently from anything Gary has run before, and the learning curve is real but not steep for a man who has been operating large agricultural equipment since his early 20s. The cab is quieter than the 8670. The fuel efficiency on the first full tank of spring tillage work tracks favorably against Gary's historical consumption numbers for the same field pass on the older Massey Ferguson. The precision agriculture integration is more seamless than what he had before, and the display system is intuitive enough that Gary is comfortable with the primary functions within the first 3 days of operation. He calls Pete on the 4th day and tells him the machine is performing the way Pete always said it would. Pete sounds pleased, in the uncomplicated way of a man who genuinely believed in what he traded and is glad to hear his assessment confirmed. The conversation is brief and friendly and ends the way their conversations have ended for 22 years, with the easy familiarity of men who know each other well enough that most of what needs to be said has already been said. Spring tillage goes without incident. Gary runs the Fendt through the better part of 6 weeks of primary tillage and planting work, accumulating somewhere between 200 and 250 hours on the machine during that period, and it does not miss a beat. The fuel numbers hold up. The transmission performs correctly. The precision agriculture systems function the way the manufacturer's documentation says they should function. By the time planting is finished and the fields are closed and the summer management season begins, Gary has settled into a comfortable familiarity with the machine that feels, from the inside, like confirmation that the decision was correct. The 8670 was a good tractor. The Fendt is a better one, at least in the ways that Gary can measure during a spring season that does not test any machine past its normal operating parameters. What happens in the 7th week of harvest changes the accounting in a way that no spring season could have predicted. Gary is in the middle of a cornfield on a Wednesday morning in the 3rd week of October, running the Fendt on grain cart duty alongside his combine, when the tractor's instrument display begins showing a fault code that he does not recognize. Not an engine fault, not a hydraulic fault, not anything in the category of mechanical failures that Gary's 40 years of equipment experience have taught him to diagnose by ear or by the feel of the machine under his hands. It is an electronics fault, a control module communication error that the display identifies with a code string that means nothing to Gary, and that his operator's manual, which he pulls out of the cab storage while the tractor is still running, describes only as a condition requiring dealer diagnosis. He calls the nearest Fendt authorized service center from the cab. The service advisor he reaches is professional and knowledgeable and genuinely helpful in the specific way of someone who understands the problem completely and cannot do anything about the timeline. The fault code Gary is describing is not something that can be diagnosed remotely or addressed with a reset procedure or managed with a temporary workaround that keeps the machine operational until a technician can get to it. It requires a technician with Fendt-specific diagnostic software, in person, with the machine present. Gary asks how soon that can happen. There is a pause on the line that tells him everything before the words do. The service advisor explains that they are in peak harvest season, that every technician on their roster is already committed to existing service calls, and that the current booking lead time for a non-emergency on-farm service visit is between 35 and 42 days. Gary is quiet for a moment after hearing that number, 35 to 42 days. He is sitting in a cornfield in the third week of October with 60% of his harvest still standing, a weather forecast that he checked that morning showing a significant precipitation system developing for the following week, and a tractor that the manufacturer's own documentation says cannot be returned to service without a technician he cannot see for more than a month. He asks whether there are other authorized service centers in the region. The advisor checks. There are 2 others within reasonable distance. Both are carrying similar booking backlogs for the same reason. It is harvest. Every large operation in the region is running equipment at maximum hours, and the demand for Fendt-specific technical service during peak season has outpaced the available technician capacity in the region. The earliest any of the 3 centers can commit to an on-farm visit is 33 days out, which is the slightly better end of the range, but is still 33 days, still past the point where Gary's harvest window has any margin left in it at all. He hangs up the phone and sits in the cab of a tractor that is running. The fault code has not shut the machine down. The Fendt's control system has placed it in a reduced functionality mode that limits certain operational parameters but does not prevent basic movement, and looks out at a cornfield that needs to come out of the ground before next week's rain system arrives, and he understands, with the particular clarity that comes from a problem that cannot be softened by optimism, exactly what the next 30 days are going to look like. He calls Pete that evening. The conversation is not easy, and Gary does not make it easy by softening what he needs to say. He explains the fault, the diagnostic requirement, the service timeline. He asks Pete directly whether the machine had shown any previous electronics faults during his 3 seasons of ownership. There is a pause on Pete's end of the line that Gary notices and files away without commenting on. Pete says the machine had 1 electronics warning during his 2nd season with it, a different fault code, which had been addressed by the dealer under warranty at the time, and that the machine had been fine since then. Gary asks whether Pete disclosed that fault during their trade conversation. Another pause. Pete says he did not think it was relevant because it had been resolved under warranty. Gary says he understands, and he says it in a way that is true. He does understand in the technical sense that Pete believes what he is saying, but the understanding and the anger are not mutually exclusive, and Gary does not pretend otherwise by the time the conversation ends. Here is where the structure of their arrangement reveals every weakness that a handshake between neighbors conceals until something goes wrong. There is no written agreement. There is no warranty transfer documentation, because no dealer was involved in the transaction and warranty transferability was never discussed. There is no recourse document, no agreed-upon process for addressing problems that emerge after the trade, no mechanism for either party to formally claim that the other owes them something specific. What there is instead is 22 years of neighborly trust and a verbal agreement between two men about two machines, one of which is now sitting in Gary's shed in reduced functionality mode while his harvest window closes by the day. Gary cannot legally compel Pete to do anything. Pete cannot legally be required to compensate Gary for anything. The fault existed in the machine before the trade. This seems, based on Pete's admission about the previous warranty repair, to be likely. But proving that a previous fault contributed to a current fault, without documentation, without dealer records that Gary does not have access to, because the warranty was in Pete's name and Pete's operation, is not something Gary can do from the seat of a broken tractor in a cornfield in October. He solves the immediate harvest crisis the only way it can be solved, which is expensively and imperfectly. He calls a custom harvesting operator who covers the region and explains his situation. The custom operator is busy. It is harvest. Every custom operator in the region is busy. But he has a window in 4 days when a scheduled job is delayed by ground conditions, and he can get Gary's remaining acreage covered if Gary is willing to pay the emergency premium rate, which is substantially higher than a preseason contracted rate would have been. Gary agrees without negotiating, because the alternative to the emergency premium rate is watching his corn stand in wet conditions for 30-plus days while he waits for a Fendt technician, and that alternative costs more than the premium rate in yield loss alone, before the drying cost increase and the lodging risk are even added to the calculation. The custom operator gets his corn out in 3 days of concentrated work that runs from first light to last light, with Gary running alongside, in whatever capacity a man can be useful when he does not have a functioning grain cart tractor and has to borrow a smaller machine from a cousin 2 townships over to keep the combine moving. The harvest is completed before the rain arrives. The yield is acceptable. The grain is in the bin. The immediate crisis is resolved. The financial accounting, when Gary finally sits down with it after harvest is done and the bins are sealed and the fields are empty, is not good. The custom harvesting premium represents a significant unplanned expense. The drying cost on corn that came out at slightly higher moisture than Gary's normal target due to the compressed harvest timeline and the inability to wait for optimal field conditions adds another layer. The borrowed machine from his cousin required a fuel contribution and a reciprocal labor commitment that Gary prices honestly at another half day of his own time during a period when his time was already stretched. And underneath all of those specific numbers sits the broader question that Gary has not yet fully answered for himself, which is what the Fendt is actually worth to his operation going forward. Given that it is a machine whose electronics fault has now been confirmed by the service center as a developing issue with a control module that will require replacement at a cost that the service advisor quotes to Gary when the technician finally arrives 36 days after the original call. The control module replacement is not covered under warranty because the warranty on the machine transferred with the original owner and Pete's warranty period has expired. Gary pays for it out of his operating account, which has enough margin to absorb the expense, but not enough to do so without Gary noticing it for the rest of the quarter. Pete comes over in November, after the repair is done and the bill is paid and the fields are worked down for winter. He comes over the way a neighbor comes over when he knows he has something to account for and is man enough to do it in person, rather than letting it sit between the farms all winter like a fence line dispute that nobody wants to acknowledge. They stand in Gary's machine shed, with the Fendt parked between them, and they have an honest conversation that takes about 40 minutes and covers the fault history, the warranty situation, the harvest timeline, the custom harvesting cost, and what fair looks like between two men who did a deal on a handshake and had the handshake tested in a way neither of them anticipated. Pete does not dispute Gary's account of the costs. He does not claim that the previous warranty fault was unrelated to the current failure. He offers to split the control module repair bill, which Gary accepts, not because the split makes the math come out even, it does not. But because it is a real gesture from a man trying to do right within the limits of what a handshake agreement leaves him able to do. The 22 years of neighborly history survives the conversation, but it carries something new in it afterward. Not quite distrust, but the particular awareness that even two men who know each other completely can create a situation between them that no amount of mutual goodwill can fully remedy once something goes wrong inside it. Gary's MF8670, the machine he traded away on that Thursday afternoon in late April, is gone. Pete sold it in August, before any of the Fendt's problems became visible, to an operator in the next county who needed a reliable working tractor and paid a fair market price for a paid-off Massey Ferguson in good mechanical condition. The machine that Gary ran for years, that he knew completely, that had no electronics faults and no service backlog and no control module vulnerabilities, is now working someone else's ground 60 miles away. Gary knows this because Pete told him in the November conversation, matter-of-factly, the way you report a fact that cannot be changed and therefore deserves no particular softening. Gary nods when Pete tells him. He does not say what he is thinking, which is the calculation that a man does when he realizes that the machine he traded away would have gotten his harvest done on time, without a service call, without a custom harvesting premium, without a control module bill, and without 36 days of waiting for a technician who needed proprietary software to address a fault that a Massey Ferguson's simpler, more field-serviceable systems would not have generated in the first place. He thinks about that calculation for a long time after Pete leaves. He thinks about it when he walks through his machine shed in December, and the Fendt is sitting there looking exactly like what it is, a more sophisticated, more capable, more technologically advanced machine than the one it replaced, and a machine that will spend the rest of its time on Gary's farm being evaluated not just on its operational specifications, but on whether it has another electronics event during another harvest window, and whether the nearest authorized service center has improved its booking capacity, and whether the control module that was replaced in November was truly the end of the issue, or simply the most recent visible symptom of a platform that was pushing its electronics architecture past what the regional service network was built to support. The Fendt is not a bad machine. Gary does not arrive at that conclusion because it is not the right conclusion. It is a capable machine with genuine performance advantages that show up on fuel consumption logs and in the transmission's behavior during complex field operations and in the precision agriculture systems that function the way they are supposed to function when they are functioning. But capability and serviceability are not the same specification. A machine that performs at a higher level when it is working and sits down harder and longer when it is not working than the machine it replaced. That trade-off is not visible in any brochure comparison, not measurable in any fuel efficiency test, and not revealed by 3 seasons of watching a neighbor's machine work adjacent fields in conditions that never happened to generate the specific fault that occurs in week 7 of a harvest season on a Wednesday morning in October. Gary Mossfeld files that understanding away in the same place he files every hard-earned piece of agricultural knowledge he has acquired in 30-plus years of farming, not as bitterness, not as a brand verdict he announces at the co-op, but as a specific, precise addition to his operational knowledge base. He adds a line to the checklist he uses when evaluating any future equipment decision. The line reads, regional service capacity, peak season booking lead time, proprietary diagnostic dependency. It is not a romantic line. It does not make for good conversation at a farm sale. But it is the line that costs nothing to add to a checklist and cost Gary Mossfeld a harvest premium, a control module, and 36 days of waiting to learn. The MF8670 is working 60 miles away. The man who bought it from Pete does not know its full history, does not know it was part of a handshake trade that went sideways in October, does not know that the man who originally owned it is standing in a machine shed in December doing the math on what it cost him to trade it away. The 8670 does not know any of this either. It is a tractor. It does not know what farm it is on, or whose hands are on the steering wheel, or what decisions were made that moved it from one machine shed to another, over the course of a single growing season. It just works. Every day, in the straightforward, non-proprietary, field-serviceable way that machines built to that philosophy work, without fault codes that require a specialist, and without booking lead times that run past the end of a harvest window. It just works. And that, in the end, is the specification that Gary Mossfeld forgot to put at the top of the list when he shook Pete Schofield's hand on a Thursday afternoon in late April and traded away the machine that had never once given him a reason to stand in a field wondering who to call.